Good morning, my magnificent young entrepreneurs. Are you ready to learn some law and make some money? Okay, welcome to Contracts Part 2. First thing we're going to talk about today is the writing requirement, also known as the Statute of Frauds. It'd actually probably be better named if it was called the Statute to Prevent Frauds, because what it is it's the requirement that certain types of contracts must be in writing and signed at least by the party against whom you're attempting to enforce the contract in order for the contract to be enforceable. Now, we are going to talk about the 5 different types of contracts that are required to be in writing and signed under the common law, that is the law developed by court cases. But there are other types of contracts which also must be in writing under local and federal statutes. So, for example, in California, there's a statutory law that says a contract between a homeowner and a contractor for home improvement projects, if the project is more than $400 or $500, that must be in writing in order to be enforceable. But we're not going to talk about all those specific statutory requirements in a basic overview course like this. We're going to talk about the 5 basic types of contracts under the common law which must be in writing. And the basic 5 are contracts involving land, contracts which by their terms take longer than 1 year to perform, contracts which are secondary or collateral agreements, which basically means personal guarantees of someone else's debt, contracts in consideration of marriage, and under the Uniform Commercial Code, contracts for the sale of goods that have a value of more than $500. In some states and in other states where they've updated their law, it's $5,000. So depending upon what state you're in, it's contracts for the sale of goods of over $500 or over $5,000. So let's look at each one of those in a little more detail for a moment. First of all, contracts involving land. Now that is any kind of a contract involving land. So contract for the purchase of land or the sale of land, or mortgaging land, putting a lien on land to obtain a loan, or maybe a lease agreement, anything having to do with land that has to be in writing. And the historic reason for that is land was sacred in the beginnings of civilization. If you were a landowner, then you were somebody. You were like a feudal land baron. And if you didn't own land, then you worked on someone else's land and you were a peasant, basically a slave. So anything having to do with land was sacred in the ancient English common law. And still today, anything involving any kind of contract involving land must be in writing. The second one is contracts which by their terms cannot be performed in less than 1 year. So contracts which take longer than 1 year to perform. But that's kind of a tricky one, because if I hired you to build a new science building for Sierra College, it might cost millions of dollars, and by the time you get all of the permits and you get the grading done and all the environmental impact reports, and then you start building, it's probably going to take you longer than a year to build that building. But the contract itself doesn't say that we want you to be building this building for a year. You might be C.C. Myers, the local wonder contractor who does projects that take other people 2 years. He does them in 2 weeks. So it's possible that you could complete the contract for building the new science building at Sierra College in less than a year. So as far as the 1 year requirement goes, that contract would not have to be in writing. Now, of course, there are a bunch of other reasons why a contract for a multi-million-dollar science building would have to be in writing. But just talking about the 1 year requirement, that one doesn't require it. But if I hire you to teach at Sierra College and I say I'll pay you $70,000 for a 5-year term, by the terms of the agreement, it would take you more than a year. It would take you 5 years to complete the performance of that contract. So that one would have to be in writing. So that's the 1 year requirement. The third requirement is personal guarantees. It's called collateral or secondary agreements. Rather poorly named, really. But what it means is if you agree to sign a personal guarantee for someone else's debt, that's got to be in writing and signed or it's not enforceable. There is, however, one exception to that rule, and that is if you're going to obtain a direct benefit from the loan. They're making the loan to one of your business associates so that he can buy a bunch of product from your company. Then if the bank messes up and forgets to have you sign the personal guarantee that you agreed to sign, you might still be on the hook. But first of all, that's so rare. The bank doesn't usually forget to have you sign a personal guarantee. But that's secondary or collateral contracts, personal guarantees of someone else's debt. And the fourth one is promises made in consideration of marriage. And I'm sorry that we're doing this course online because you're going to miss all the fun. One of the great advantages to doing this like as a talking head, like a newscaster, is you don't get to see that I'm also, well, you do get to see that I'm also old, but you don't see that in the back of my head I'm balding and I'm also fat with a big pot belly. Not a sexy guy. And I usually have fun in this part of the contract here on, or part of the contracts course on statute of frauds in marriage. I ask some young gal in the classroom if she would marry me. And they know it's just a hypothetical because I'm already married, but I either get a quick no, shivering in horror, or I get some kind of a silly grin. But sometimes before they answer, I say, now wait. Or even if they say no, I say, now wait, now let's look at this. Suppose that when I ask you to marry me, I'm a multi-millionaire, and I say, look, I've only got 6 months to live. I've already been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and I'm a multi-millionaire, and I just want to die happy and not alone. So if you'll marry me, I'll leave you $1 million and my 60-foot yacht and my brand new Mercedes. So after I tell the gal that I'll leave her $1 million and a 60-foot yacht and a Mercedes, sometimes she hesitates or considers the possibility. But if she doesn't, if she's still a definite no, sometimes I get a guy in the class who says, hey, if she won't marry you, I will. We have some fun. So I'm sorry you're missing out on that fun, but the important thing to remember is contracts made, if someone makes you a bunch of promises in exchange for you agreeing to marry them, you better get that all in writing, because if you don't, it's not enforceable. And then when the rich old fat guy dies of his heart attack and you're expecting your $1 million and his kids show up, if you don't have that in writing, you may not get it. At the very least, you're going to have a big court battle. The fifth type of contract that must be in writing is under the Uniform Commercial Code. If you make a contract for a purchase or sale of goods having more than a certain value, then that also must be in writing. And the amount originally was $500, but as inflation made prices go up higher and higher, the UCC said, let's change that to $5,000. And they took it back to the individual states for approval of that recommendation of increasing the amount to $5,000. Only some of these states approved that, others did not. So depending on so here we have an area where the Uniform Commercial Code is not uniform from state to state. In some states, it's sale of goods having a value of more than $500, and in others it's more than $5,000. But those are the 5 types of contracts which must be in writing and signed at least by the person against whom you're trying to enforce the agreement in order for them to be enforceable. Now, let's see, did I cover everything? Pretty much, but I want to cover a couple of other things. The writing, when we think of the requirement of a writing, we usually think of a fancy typed up contract made up by the lawyers, and it's all typed and fancy. But the writing requirement does not have to be that fancy at all. It could be a message between two merchants, and it just says, I want to buy 5,000 bicycle frames. How much will you charge me? And he says, $30 a frame. And he says, okay, send them. Just a few notes back and forth, a couple of order forms or invoices, as long as they're signed by the person against whom you're trying to enforce the agreement, that would be good enough. It might be a series of notes that go back and forth. It might be something you wrote up on a cocktail napkin at a lunch meeting, and you both signed it. So the writing requirement is not that you have a fancy formal typed up contract. It's any series of writings that show the terms of the agreement and show a signature by the person against whom you're trying to enforce the contract. Now, one other important point about the statute of frauds is, as we begin to do more and more international business across national borders, you need to always remember that the statute of frauds is pretty much an English common law concept, and it exists in American law and English law. But if you're doing business in some other non-English country, many of those countries do not have any writing requirement at all in their laws. And so you're on the phone and you talk about buying 10,000 widgets from some guy in a foreign country, and you say, okay, I'll take them. And what you mean in your mind is, I'll take them, but our lawyers will meet with your lawyers and write up a technical contract, and we don't have a deal until we sign the final paperwork. And the guy on the other side of the phone says, we just closed a deal. You're buying 10,000 widgets at such and such a price. So be careful doing business across international borders, because the statute of frauds may not exist in the other